Hello, it's Wednesday night. I'm Yisrael Live. I'm your host, and my co-host Joseph Cohen. We have today a really interesting guest. He goes by the name of Levi Meir, and he is the only Jew in Kurdistan. Well, that's how we're introducing him. So, as you can see, Levi he's an American Jew who splits his time between the Kurdish Autonomous Region and the United States. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to just let Levi talk to you, explain sort of his background, why he's on the show, what his connection is to Kurdistan, and he can fill you in himself. And then we're going to ask him some questions.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the introduction. I think there's different components to it. I want to talk a little bit about the Kurdistan region as just someone who I think it's an important moral cause to discuss and to have people learn more about. Personally, my own journey to get to the Kurdistan region, and then once I was there, I've been living in Erbil for over 7 years now, and sort of the factors that got me involved with Jewish advocacy and that eventually connected me to working with the leadership of the Jews from Kurdistan that now live outside of Kurdistan region, and then ultimately getting involved also in exploring anti-Semitism more broadly. And these are things which became very personal to me too, because I felt that for the long term, they're essential for my safety, for my own well-being, and I hope also for really reconciliation. A lot of things that I've been able to learn, I think, are sort of the stress points that inhibit that.
So maybe just as a real, just zooming out, we'll have a lot of people watching who maybe aren't even familiar of what Kurdistan is, where it is. So maybe just give a very brief overview of the Kurdistan region.
Okay, all right. This is actually really exciting. So I think some people might have heard the word Kurds, but maybe not even. So Kurdistan in general, as just a word, refers to areas where Kurdish people who speak Kurdish are the majority or a very significant population. And Kurdistan is kind of unique because as a region, broadly, it spans several different countries. There's also Kurdish communities in some other places. There's also many Kurds in Europe, and there are many Kurdish descended tribes all the way to Egypt. Like you'll have villages called such and such al-Kurdi because of the Ayyubids. But in terms of the actual Kurdistan, it's areas where you have people who identify as Kurdish and who speak the Kurdish language. Now within that, one specific part of it is in Iraq. And in Iraqi Kurdistan, since the 1990s to today, the Kurdish people there have had a semi-autonomous government. So in the Kurdistan region, we have our own parliament, we have our own president, prime minister, our own laws. There are absolutely zero Iraqi, federal Iraqi military or anything like that, Iraqi army, none of that. It's all Kurdistan region military called the Peshmerga. So it's a really cool thing. So I know that's a lot to put into just a few sentences. That's in a nutshell what Kurdistan is, what Kurdistan is not, what the Kurdistan region is.
And I guess many people who will have heard of Kurdistan, a lot of them will have heard of it in the context of the recent violence that's flared up there between ISIS and certainly in Syria and parts of Iraq, where you've had numerous terrorists and various militias engaged in conflict. How far is Erbil, where you're based? How far is that from the conflict?
It's a really important topic to address because Kurdish people as a whole are in conflict, really in a fight for survival. And that is actually something I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, is I think one of the common grounds between the Kurdish Muslim majority society and then the Jewish society. There's like a strong sense of brotherhood that's very palpable even on the ground in Erbil. In terms of the violence, the violence in the Syrian civil war is apocalyptic. You have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people being killed, and many of them are Kurds. Some of them live in Damascus. Some of them live in the Kurdistan of Syria, which is called Rojava, meaning like the west, like the western sector of Kurdistan. It's hard to say because it might not be very far in terms of the kilometers, but I'll have a friend who came to Erbil, the Kurdistan region, for safety. In the midst of all that violence, the Kurdistan region is very safe, extraordinarily safe. We have essentially next to zero terrorism. Kidnappings are extraordinarily rare. I'll put it this way: it's no different than like a London or a Los Angeles. It is that safe. I find that in general, besides a few issues which I encountered targeted against me specifically, related to anti-Semitism, in general, it's you don't have to worry about conflict in the Kurdistan region. That being said, though, I mean, I'll have a Kurdish friend, and we were getting together for coffee, and he invited another friend of his, and I asked her, like, oh, where are you from? And she was saying that she's from Damascus, but she moved to Erbil because her husband was killed by a missile. He was walking on the street in Damascus, and she was like, he did nothing. He was not involved in anything, and it was just a freak accident. So she's now the sole breadwinner for her kids, for her in-laws, for everybody. And I only go into these like kind of extended anecdotal stories to show that the violence is not in Erbil, but it hits very close to home. And we have a huge population of internally displaced people, Arabs and Yazidis and other people, and also many Kurds who are refugees from Syria.
Excellent. So it's really, really fascinating. It's a region which most of us, and the people, truthfully, that most of us get very, very rarely see, both in the media and certainly speaking to someone who's experienced it and lived there. So maybe if we now come back, we've zoomed in a little bit on some of the more dramatic aspects of the region, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But maybe just start with the story of how you ended up there, what you're doing there, because I've read some really fascinating things about things that you're doing in relation to the Jewish community. So yeah, just maybe take us through your journey.
So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about it, because I think also it's kind of an experience that a lot of Americans, I think a lot of British Jews will maybe relate to, sort of like where I started, and then sort of like how it became increasingly maybe unique. But my own background is very typical. I mean, there's nothing really that would maybe necessarily indicate like this journey that led me to the Kurdistan region, just on paper. But being Jewish on my mother's side and being Okinawan on my father's side, I grew up with a strong sense of what it means to have to fight for your survival. And not a lot of people maybe know about Okinawans, but it's an indigenous minority in Japan, and the Okinawan community encountered a lot of violence in World War II, and then over the decades has had really a fight for cultural survival. And so when I started to learn about the Kurdistan region, maybe not the specifics of the Kurdistan region, but the power dynamics at play were very relatable on both sides of my family. So you could say it was like a very fertile ground for solidarity. So I visited, all this led up, I was in university, I was very interested, I was studying the ancient Near East, I wanted to visit the archaeological sites. I was 19 years old, and that was when I first visited Erbil. And it was, I don't know how to put it, it's almost hard to describe. I just kind of had a feeling that this was a place where I would want to spend more time, a place where I'd want to live. And I just felt like I knew it. So I visited Erbil when I was 19, and I went back to LA after that. I was just there as a tourist for a few weeks. But after I finished university, I moved back. So I moved back in 2014. And this was right when the war with the Islamic State was really raging. So in Erbil, we weren't having, ISIS in Erbil at all. But, Erbil's border was with ISIS. Erbil had a border against ISIS. So when I went there, everything, I was hearing stories about people fleeing from their homes. I was hearing stories about people who are experiencing genocide by ISIS, Yazidis. And I think everybody has the capability to listen and to understand. But I think hearing my own family's stories of my father's mother hiding in a cave in World War II and having bones around her, and her whole childhood centering around death. And then on my mother's side, about people fleeing and a lot of people not making it. Hearing these stories was very relatable, and I felt almost like I don't want to say like a rage, but a rage that I felt like the world wasn't listening. And when the world did pay attention, they would sometimes fetishize the violence. I would see a lot of news about, Kurdish women taking up arms, and it made me very uncomfortable that people would celebrate it when the fact is that taking up arms is something that you shouldn't have to do just to live. And I felt that wasn't really being interrogated very much. So anyways, if I'm going off on a lot of interconnected things, it's because there really were a lot of components that kind of made me get there. But once I was in Erbil, also the economy has a lot of opportunities. It's a beautiful place to live, even with all the suffering that was happening. Little things. My friends were not having weddings because it was nothing but funerals during the war with ISIS. It was a very grim time, but there would be weekends where I would go out, and then people think sometimes it's a desert there. No, there's waterfalls, there's rivers, there's mountain peaks, there's archaeological sites. You can see astonishing, you could say biblical history in general right there. You have the tomb of the prophet Nahum in Al-Qush. You have Neo-Assyrian archaeological sites with Lamassu, like things that you would only see in the British Museum or in the Louvre, or you can see it right there in the Kurdistan region, just out. And not only there, just out, but the community is living and breathing. You have a really remarkable Assyrian community, and the Assyrians, they still speak Aramaic. And the communities of Jews that lived under the Kurdish Aghas, they also spoke Aramaic. So it's just, there's like a compaction of time and things that you would never expect to see. And it's this incredible natural splendor and history. So amidst all of that, I decided, like, you know what, I'm going to buy my apartment. I don't want to have to always change apartments if I change jobs or this or that. I'm going to buy my apartment. I'm going to just allow this to become my main focus. So that's like that.
Okay, so just if we can circle back a little bit, when you arrived in Kurdistan, do you speak Kurdish? Did you have to learn it? Did you know anything when you got there? How did you go about finding a job? All these sort of questions.
Oh yeah, so
just from a practical point of view.
So if anybody's interested, by the way, I am more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has personally. Also, if anybody's listening and they want to visit or move to Kurdistan, I'm happy to answer anything. Generally speaking, it's actually very easy. So this is one thing where being a foreigner has actually been a huge privilege, being a foreigner who speaks English as a native language. So when I arrived, I did not speak essentially one word of Kurdish. Over the years, I've been fortunate to learn Kurdish. And
speak Arabic at all? How were you able to communicate with the people you encountered?
It was very, very, very challenging. So the interesting thing is, Kurds are very marginalized. How do you say, like, people will not speak Kurdish unless they are Kurdish generally. So Kurds are oftentimes trilingual, speak 4 languages fluently. Arabic to the level of, like, they did their doctorate in Arabic. Kurdish in that they are a poet because Kurdish is their mother tongue. English because they consume media and scholarly materials from around the world. So there are so many Kurds who speak intermediate to fluent English. Oftentimes I tell my Kurdish friends, I tell them they speak better English than I do because they have more important things to say than I do. So, but it was very easy. It wasn't a big issue. And I didn't really speak Arabic. I spoke like a few words, but my Arabic is still very, very weak, unfortunately. But my advice is that anybody can pretty much come. And if you speak even a little bit of English, it's easy to navigate. In terms of finding a job, so when I first visited, I just by chance, met this amazing, I don't know how to describe her, somewhere between like a cultural consultant, producer, fixer. She was working with a team that was doing a documentary on women's rights for Kurdish women and the experience of very, very grim experience of femicide. So women who are killed by their families to send a message about different things. So she was working on this documentary, and just by chance, I met her. It was unbelievable, and she was so well connected, so knowledgeable. So one day I was in New York, and she was like, I'm gonna come visit," and I was like, "Oh, what?" So we were spending time, and she said, "Levy, do you still want to move to Kurdistan? You always said you wanted to live there, and you've been talking about it for years." I'm like, "Yes, I do." And she was like, "Okay, call this number." So there was a school that was in desperate need of teachers, and it was very hard, unfortunately, because the recruiting, because of the war situation, was just being, it was scaring off a lot of people who had signed up. So I'll never forget. I'm there, and I call this school, and they're like, we do an interview, and they say, if I remember correctly, I think it was like a Monday, and they said, "Oh, can you come on Wednesday?" And I was like, "Okay." So that was it. And that was my first, you could say, break. Now, visiting as a tourist, you get a visa on arrival if you're American. It's very easy. And also getting work, I have since found out, is very easy. So my experience getting a teaching job is not all that unusual. So I got there as a teacher, and then I started working as a software developer, actually. So it was kind of an interesting transition. So I was working as a teacher for a year, and then I got a job working in marketing, but I was working on the analytics side more of marketing. So I got a job as a software developer, and then I was able to buy an apartment like a few months later. I wasn't making a big salary. It was just the property there is very cool.
And so I guess one of my questions, I'm always interested in Jews. I'm like obsessed with Jews. I devote my life to defending them and spend every day studying the religion. And Kurdistan, there's such a thing as a Kurdish Jew. What's left of the Kurdish Jewish community there and around the world? Just fill us in a little bit about the Jewish community, because I'm fascinated.
So this is something where I guess I should say, sometimes I'll speak from my personal voice, and this has been an amazing opportunity to speak about my personal feelings, things like this. Sometimes I'll speak just trying to convey like a mainstream terminology, what is Kurdistan, who are Kurds, things like that. But on the topic of Jews from Kurdistan, I was very, very, very blessed to work with Dr. Mordechai Zaken, who, until he passed away a few months ago, was one of the top scholars in Israel, period. He received the Prime Minister Prize in Israel, an amazing, it's hard, I can't even put into words. He worked in the Ministry of Public Security. He was the head of Minority Affairs, did tremendous work on the interaction between Jews and Muslims. So anyways, to answer your question, after working with the leadership of the Jews from Kurdistan, including Dr. Mordechai Zaken, there are certain things which I can kind of convey from sort of like an establishment point of view, things that I've had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Mordechai Zaken about, talk to other leaders in the community. So the answer is, unfortunately, there are currently no more Jews from Kurdistan left in Kurdistan. Each community, each village by village, each cluster of Jewish families that left the Kurdistan region, when they left, that was it. There was nobody left behind. Sometimes there would be a distant relative who had been sometimes forcibly married into a Muslim family. You could say bride napping. But there was nobody who was, you could say, recognized as Jewish and whose children would be recognized as Jewish officially. So there are unfortunately no more Jews, but there is a lot of Jewish heritage. And one of the interesting things that I think maybe more than in the Arab society or even other Muslim societies, Kurds are actually proud of having a Jewish ancestor. A lot of Kurds will speak very proudly about having a great grandfather who was Jewish, having a mosque in their neighborhood, and that mosque was funded by a man who had been born Jewish, but you could say is converted to Islam, and then at least from that point on, became like recognized as like a Muslim leader. Like, Kurds are very proud of this, like very multifaceted identity. So, I hope that explains why I'm able to speak on an issue when I'm not myself.
You mentioned village by village they left. Was that under Saddam Hussein? Was that like, how did that exodus or that flight happen, and why did it happen?
So there were different things in different countries. So for Iran, Kurds in Iran, Jewish Kurds in Iran, there was kind of a gradual process where a lot of Kurdish majority towns, nowadays the synagogues are abandoned. The Jews went to some other urban centers. And even if they would have originally been Jews from Kurdistan, now they became, you could say, Persian Jews. In Syria, the situation was very gradual. I think a lot of people who have heard about kind of the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Syria, it happened over decades, and the situation was atrocious. You had violence, just horrible restrictions put on Jewish life. That also impacted Jews that were in Kurdish towns. In Turkey, the situation was a bit different. A lot of it has to do with Jews also urbanizing in like Istanbul and leaving behind their Kurdishness, and the lack of rabbis. Like, you don't have a rabbi in Diyarbakir, so how do you know if someone has a mother who is Jewish? In the Iraqi part specifically, so as you're asking about like Saddam Hussein, after, it's tough because I want to talk about it just technically, but it becomes very emotional also for me in some ways. So I describe Middle East as the place where Hitler never lost, if you will, at least ideologically. If you go to a bookstore in a lot of the Arab cities, and even in Erbil, actually, you'll find translations of Mein Kampf. Like, sometimes I'll ask, like, do you have a history section or section on like Jews? Someone will be like, well, we do have this, and they'll point me to Mein Kampf. I'm serious. It's horrifying. So, if you look at one era of when Jews were expelled, you have to look at how, not just as it happened and then it was done. It happened, but how is it actively enforced in official or unofficial ways? And Saddam Hussein had a really big part of that. The actual fleeing of Jews just escaping from the Kurdish areas was actually in the 1950s, though. So in the 1940s, there was a lot of political turmoil in Iraq, and you had, very briefly, a Nazi government, very pro-Nazi government, take over. And I think many people have heard of the Farhud. It's a term that I think a lot of Jews maybe have heard about, maybe don't know that much about it. But the interesting thing about the Farhud is, some people interpret it as like, oh, there was Muslim violence in Baghdad, there was Arab violence. And I always say, like, it wasn't just that. It's that people were permitted. When the Farhud ended, the people who did the violence were still there. But you could say the permission, like, they didn't have impunity. So the Farhud was one of the main events that really started the purging of Jews from all of Iraq. I touched on the other countries, Iran, Syria, a little bit of Turkey, but in Iraq specifically, the Farhud was a very kind of like the beginning of the end. And that also applied not just to Baghdad or, the Arab areas, but also to the Kurdistan region. You have, with the start of these, you could say, modern governments after the Ottomans, you have, central, very organized registration of IDs. You had censuses that impacted the whole country. So what was kind of unique was that for the first time, you could have a list of all the Jews and their elimination. So you had these mechanisms of power that were increasingly available. So after the Farhud, a lot of Jews started really looking at immigration as their future. And so there were already Kurdish Jewish communities in Israel. There were very established communities. Like I have some friends from some villages in Kurdistan who now live in Israel, but they've lived in Israel since the 1920s. So there was already a dialogue happening. There was already, interestingly, in Erbil in particular, there was a lot of fundraising for Zionism, and so people would raise money, and they wanted to support the ability for Jews to buy land. It was already present. There was already like connections, if you will. You had, if I remember correctly, there was like a future prime minister of Israel who had actually come to Kurdistan and met with the Jewish leaders in Kurdistan. It was very interesting. The Kurdish community in general the Kurdish Muslim community in general was very, I would say, relatively positive towards Jews. You had Kurdish aghas who took their responsibility very seriously to protect their Jewish minorities. You had some aghas who were very good and some aghas who were not so good. Some aghas would think of the price of safety as slavery, essentially. So keeping certain Jews as slaves. And sometimes that was just a few, sometimes it was many, sometimes it was enforced with violence. In some cases, there was sexual violence against women. That was a matter of policy. They say policy by an agha. Sometimes there was, situations where there was a lack of justice. When I got involved with the Kurdish Jewish community in Israel, there were requests and things which it was emotionally very horrifying. I would get a request and they would be like, my uncle was murdered by this person. And this was a Jewish family and their uncle had been murdered by a non-Jew. And so there was no recourse. There was no such thing as a justice. There was no such thing as a murder trial. And they knew who the murderer was. And there was one family who even said that their uncle had been murdered, but the murderer had come to the family to tell them. That was how they found out he had been murdered. And it was just this grotesqueness. So that was why they really harped onto us. And they were like, we want to talk to his descendants. Like they were saying, we want to talk to the murderer's descendants. So, even that was actually an area that's considered like very good on the coexistence scale. So, when things went bad, they could go very bad, but it wasn't that every family was having this happen to them. So when the opportunity came to do a mass aliyah in the 1950s, it was the dissolution of thousands of years of history within just a few years. From 1950 to 1952, you had really just village by village. Traditionally, you would have like a few Jewish families living in a village. There was mostly Muslim. And then on the weekend, on Shabbat, they would come together and they would see other Jewish families from other surrounding villages at like a kind of like a central synagogue. So there was like just really this village by village, family by family, everybody gone.
That's really that structure, that setup is. I haven't really heard of that before in any Jewish communities, because usually Jews need facilities to exist. So to have a small number of Jews in each village, and then one central synagogue. That's an unusual setup. Like, how many families would there be in the villages typically?
So I actually had your exact same question, because I was like, this is so strange. So I had the chance to talk to Dr. Zakin a lot about things like this, because it comes up a lot where somebody will ask me, they'll be from a village, a Muslim family, and they'll be like, they'll ask me questions about the Jewish history, or they'll point to like a heritage site where they're like, oh, we still call this the Field of the Jews, something like this. So I asked him, because it also struck me as a little bit unusual. So there were some urban centers. You had Erbil, Zaho, Sulaymaniyah, Koya, also called Koy Sinjak. So you had some places where you would have all the figures you would expect. You would have, of course, like a butcher, certainly a rabbi, a synagogue. But in a lot of other areas, for example, you would have an Ahmadi, what we would describe as an urban community, with a synagogue, you could say a built community. And then in the surrounding villages, when they needed certain things, they would actually have to have people from Ahmadi come to do, for example, a circumcision, or do a, even for simple things like butchered meat, they would have to get it from Ahmadi. I don't know exactly why there was this unusual structure. Another thing that does come to mind is that the Kurdistan region, and this is an interesting kind of connection where broader Kurdish experience was really also felt by the Jews. Kurds were often extremely marginalized. And Mesopotamia as a whole, especially the Kurdish areas, was in some degree kind of like a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. And so there was, really high rates of illiteracy in some places. In some parts, wheat was so expensive because it was so hard to get that people would make their bread out of oftentimes rice and ash. Like the type of poverty that it's hard to even describe. I'm just like, wow, And nowadays it's totally different. But what's interesting is that a lot of the Jews, so in that context, I'm only painting that picture so you really see that in that context, what's unusual about a lot of the Jews from Kurdistan is that many of them, I would expect probably less so in the urban centers for sure, but a lot of them were illiterate, which was highly unusual for a Jewish community or a Jewish society in general. So the Jews from Kurdistan were quite unique. And another thing that strikes me as quite unique is that, for my own family, when I think about like Yiddish, I think about this dialogue, this porosity between broader non-Jewish society and exchange of words. When I think of Ladino, we think of it obviously as like this fusion of Spanish and Hebrew, and even Jews in India had interesting fusions. But what's interesting, the Jews from Kurdistan spoke Aramaic. That speaks to a degree of you could say, I don't know how to describe it, like extremely conserved aspects of the culture, I'll put it that way. So in many ways, it was very unique. It was very, very interesting. I mean, yes, the Aramaic had many, at times they would absorb Kurdish words, it would absorb Arabic words, but, still speaking Aramaic, wow. And then just kind of the last thing that comes to mind about why that social structure maybe made sense is that the Jews oftentimes had a very close, not necessarily totally positive, but a very close relationship with the Agha. So the Agha would, really establish the terms of where they lived and how they lived. Oh, I can't quite hear.
I muted myself. I'm really sorry. I do it every single show. So yeah, I was just saying it's really fascinating hearing the history of the Kurdish Jews, what happened to them, where they ended up. As I understand it now, there's about 200,000 of them living in Israel. Actually, Davin, when I'm in Israel, friends of mine have set up a shul, which is in an old Kurdish synagogue. And so you've got all the old Kurdish Chachamim, the rabbis on the walls, which is really fascinating. It's a Hasidic place now, but it's the legacy of the Kurdish rabbis lives on in Nachlaot in Jerusalem. But yeah,
it's the same synagogue. I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's the one where you go up the steps and then you go in, and like when you enter the door on the right, you have the wall and it's like Abdullah.
Yeah.
I think it's the synagogue I usually go to. I think I'm not kidding. I think it's the same one.
What I really think is quite interesting is that today. So, are there any other Jews in Western Kurdistan, Eastern Kurdistan, Turkish Kurdistan? Not necessarily Kurdish Jews, but just Jews in general. So there's you. Is there anything else going on Jewish-wise, or do we need to set up a Chabad house there? What?
So it's so in Turkey, thankfully, Turkey has a very durable Jewish population, and there's like a really, really, really cool cultural work being done there now by certain rabbis. And there's like one rabbi in particular, and he did a road trip where he went all around Turkey, and he also went to areas that now have large Kurdish populations. So within the context of Turkey being safe, and Turkey having, in Istanbul, truly a center of Jewish life, that does get broadcast out, and there's awareness. There's amazing work being done by established leaders. If you go to the Kurdish towns like Diyarbakir, there's no Jews left. There used to be Jews, for example, in areas like New Sabine. You have in Jizra, there was a shrine, and they say it's the shrine of the Prophet Noah. And I think to myself, like, oh, it's interesting. And so then I went to it. I thought it was just like an Islamic site, but then later on, I was informed that it was originally a Jewish site, and I was like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense, So there's a lot of things there, but the situation in Turkey is very central. You could say like headquartered in Istanbul, and just from what I understand, because like people I've spoken to, this is something where I'm not as knowledgeable. There are people more knowledgeable about the situation in Turkey, but from what I've understood, like people sometimes have an ancestor from Diyarbakir or an ancestor from Jizida, but if they lived in Istanbul for a few generations, they assimilate into the Istanbuli milieu. In terms of Syria, in the Kurdish area, zero, none. In Iran, so in all areas of where you could say Jews who would identify as being from Kurdistan and who speak Aramaic, zero also in Iran. There are a lot of people who have some ancestry. Like it comes up a lot. You'll see on Twitter sometimes someone will have one of my one of my least favorite experiences is when someone introduces themselves as Jewish. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, and they're from like a Kurdish city, and I'm like, so does your family? Are they observant? Like, what happened? And they're like, oh yeah, my father's father was Jewish. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, that doesn't really, but people are proud of having ancestry, which is good, I guess. Yeah, in terms of the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan, they don't have, their rabbis don't have anybody they recognize as Jewish at all. In terms of for myself, there are a lot of expats though who, especially, and Erbil is safe. So if you want to go there as an American, many Americans also happen to be Jewish. There's some people, maybe someone even like a Kurdish guy, gets married to an American, and the American happens to be Jewish. That does happen. It's a thing, but it's very. I know of like one situation like that, and then I know a few expats who just work there, and then myself. It's really, really slim. One of the challenges is that, because how do I say, the Jews from Kurdistan have a very important role to play in reconciliation, and so one thing with my own gradual involvement in this has been, to really focus on the Jews from Kurdistan. There are great groups from Chabad to just general advocacy groups to you could say like peace building organizations that do great work, but I feel like I won't ever feel satisfied unless the actual Kurdish rabbis can have their voice heard, because there are amazing Kurdish rabbis. There's amazing Kurdish Jewish academic leadership, social leadership, cultural leadership. And I think, we'll never have true reconciliation unless, it becomes a normal thing to see a Kurdish Jewish musician able to play with like a Kurdish Muslim in Kurdistan. There's so much to it that goes beyond the religion, and it goes beyond just a place name. Like the way that Dr. Zakin described it, and we had a lot of time to kind of work on this as like an official position, is that when someone says Jews from Kurdistan, they're not saying that the Jews were necessarily ethnically Kurdish. It's not what that means. It refers to the fact that Jews were living in an area through the Kurdish aghas, through a Kurdish system. But that it is much deeper than just saying a French Jew. It has something that's a little bit more deep than just saying, oh, I'm an American Jew. When someone was a Jew from Kurdistan, it really meant that they were part of the Kurdish cultural world. So I think I think so. To answer your question, even though there's nobody left, and kind of my own census, if you will, I think that's a key thing about the future, is that the future has to really center first and foremost the Kurdish leadership, the Kurdish Jewish leadership, of course.
Does
So
the Kurdish
just one-
Jewish sorry, go on, Alexander.
No, so I was just going to say, you were talking before about the different people that you meet there, and so one thing that's not clear to me, and maybe that's just because I missed it. Are you openly living as a Jew there? Like when you meet people, do they know that you're Jewish? Is there a select group of people that you tell, or is it just common knowledge that you're?
Do you wear a
an American
kippah?
Jew?
Do you wear a kippah? Do you have tzitzit out there? How Jewish are you when you're in Kurdistan?
So this is actually, I'm going to take a moment to then kind of like talk about it as like a personal experience, because it's something that I think a lot of Americans can relate to. And so what's kind of interesting, just to look at where I am now versus where I was before. When I moved to Erbil, I had never been to Israel. My mother had studied in Israel. She went to art school in Israel, but I had never been. And I was kind of indifferent, I guess you could say. I just didn't really think about it that much. That's politically speaking. In terms of religion, I was raised totally secular. I was raised very proudly Jewish. Like there was something where maybe I was a little bit like a bit of an overachiever in my family in that regard. Like when I think I was 19 or something, I started loosely like keeping kosher, like keeping uncertain things. And then over the years, I became strictly kosher. And then, how do I say? I started from a very secular point, but when I was there, I had experiences that really started to change me. You know, one of the things is that I would go to places and people would be like, "Oh, this used to be a Jewish house," and it was in ruins. It smelled like urine and feces. And then someone would be like, "Oh, this was the synagogue, and there's a wall." I'm like, "Is that supposed to make me feel good?" I mean, when I look at this, I feel like a pain of something really awful. And then there would be awful things like, you know, people would send me like one person sent me a WhatsApp video, and they were like, "Oh, this is a Torah, and someone wants to sell it." And I'm like, "What?" And they were like unrolling it on the floor, and there were people like with their shoes, and they were like someone like stepping on it. They were trying to say like, "Oh, read it," and they were like holding it upside down. I'm like, "Oh my God!" Like things that I found really like I started to. It started from a position of almost of really pain and discomfort, starting to really interrogate like, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? Because yes, I was open. I would from the day that I arrived, I had no doubt that I would be, continuing. I would have Passover every year. I would do like a little Hanukkah candle lighting for, it was kind of like a fun way to like invite people over. And Passover became huge. My apartment is not like a gigantic apartment, but I would have like dozens of people coming, even like some, you might call them like influencers would like catch wind of it and they'd want to like check it out. And like, it was really interesting. Had a wonderful positive response. But as I started to get more connected to this idea of like, well, who are the Jews who lived here? I started to meet Kurdish Jews. This is what's kind of interesting, is that was my first interaction, like meaningful interaction with an Orthodox community. And so my own family is so secular. I have one cousin, and she was like really shocked because one of her sons became Orthodox. And for me, I was kind of, at the time I was thinking to myself, I would like, why would you be shocked? It's a good thing. But she was like, oh, it's too much. It's too much. So my family was in some ways, not necessarily anti-religious, but, not very organized. I'll put it that way. So, as I got involved more with the community and as I started to really learn more, it drove me to want to study more. I studied academic perspectives on a lot of Jewish topics, in university. My major is microbiology, but my minor was ancient Near East history. So I had to study about Jerusalem. We had to study the Tanakh a lot. Like there were a lot of like sections that were historically relevant, archaeologically. But this was my first time where I had to like really start to learn. So ironically, pandemic aside, I decided to not necessarily hold public holidays as much if I couldn't have like certain types of separation, things like this. So I used to have like a wonderful Passover, almost like the true festivities, but I've really tried to become a lot more observant. And part of it is that I feel that if coming from a position of coming from a secular family, of not being that knowledgeable, it really horrified me that after an ethnic cleansing with 0 survivors left, with the homes in ruins and the synagogues destroyed, and like decades of pain and alienation by the Kurdish Jews, it felt so wrong of me that if I do a Passover and if I make a small mistake, not even realizing it, it just felt like I have to do more. I have to try harder. I have to have some respect for this community and how they would want to be respected. Not just being publicly Jewish, but pursuing something that I feel that would honor their legacy. As someone who is not Kurdish, it's also a very sensitive position to be in. So I hope that kind of answers the question. Yes, very open, but a lot of sensitivities around it that I've had to examine.
And so I guess you're saying it is a safe place to the extent that you can have Muslim Kurds over to your house, and it's completely fine that you're Jewish. I think that's one of the things. I've got friends who get nervous walking around central London with a kippah on, and you're in a Muslim majority region, albeit Kurdish, and you're saying actually it's completely safe to exist as a Jew there today, or at least you feel safe.
So I would say honestly that I feel safer in the Kurdistan region in that respect, just as someone walking down the street, than I would honestly in a lot of the United States. I think it's kind of sad that places that we used to think of as very safe, like the US and like London, Europe, are maybe not as safe anymore as we would want. That being said,
call me a cynic. I find that I just find it hard to believe. On the doorstep of ISIS, you like literally were knocking at the door, and thankfully have been somewhat beaten back. That you still feel safer there. I mean, how much of that? I mean, are there terror attacks in Erbil? I would assume that there are terror attacks in Erbil, but maybe.
So there's a very big difference, and this is a bit of like a subtlety, and I don't know how easy it'll be to kind of describe briefly, but there's a very big difference between living or visiting as a Jewish person, even visibly Jewish. There's a very difference between that, which is generally, I would say, extraordinarily safe. I mean, I have had so many funny experiences. Some of them I'm like, that doesn't quite hit the mark, but I feel that the intentions are really warm. Like one time one thing that was really on the mark was I was buying a bunch of Kurdish outfits for my friends in Israel just to bring as gifts. So I was buying all these clothes, and then someone asked me, that one of the people selling the clothes was like, why are you buying all these outfits? And I was like, oh, I'm bringing them to my friends. And I don't know how it is, but sometimes people just know. I'm like, I don't know why. But the guy was like, oh, you're bringing them to Israel. And I was like, yeah. And he was delighted. Everybody was so happy. They were like, we want to take, like, we were taking videos, and they were saying like you are our brothers. Come to visit us in Erbil. We love you. There is really a philo-Semitism, really. And the official narrative, if you will, by the government is that coexistence has to be the policy. There has to be respect for the different religions. There has to be just at least an expectation of safety on the streets. Some things have not always hit the mark as well. Like there was one time I went to a hotel, and the hotel, went to a different city in Kurdistan. I went to Dahuk, and the front desk, this is wild. They they were like, oh, they were writing down my name, and they were like, Levi, are you Jewish? I was like, yeah. And the guy, I'm not kidding, he pulls out a giant Israeli flag from behind the counter, and he's like, welcome to Kurdistan. And I was like, oh my God, like what is going on? Like I was like, the intentions are very good. That's not exactly how I would feel. Like there's the kind of that association of Jewish and Israeli. Like I feel like it's important to support Israel, but like people have to also understand about Jewish life enough to understand the complexities of it. So in that context, yes, it's safe. In terms of becoming like active, in terms of advocacy, I had a really unfortunate shift. There was it's hard to describe, because when I say it, like I'm speaking it as words, like in a conversation, but it was something that was so terrifying, and still is terrifying for me. But there was a group of people who they were showing up in the news. They were trying to claim that they were a long lost congregation of Jews, and that they were coming out of the shadows and wanted to show themselves to the world finally. And they were trying to they were not Jewish at all. It was a group of like about a dozen men, but they were trying to get, it sounds crazy, they were trying to get asylum in Europe or do Aliyah to Israel, and they were trying to do like a racket where they sell fake visas to Israel to people. And so last year in July, I had an attempt where they tried to hurt me, to kill me. And the idea was that they were stalled. They weren't able to get asylum anywhere. People, obviously, they're not recognized. They're not Jewish. Like they literally, I'm not kidding. They invited this random, it's not Kurdish at all, but this random rabbi, they invited him to Kurdistan. And the rabbi was like, you guys are not Jewish. Like what is this? I spoke to, I had to interview them for the National Association of Jews from Kurdistan. I also myself, I'd interview them like one by one, not as a religious leader, but just, I'm not a religious leader, but just as someone to collect information. And like one of them was like, oh, my father's father was Jewish. And I was like, okay, I mean, you're not Jewish. He's like, no, I am now. And I'm like, what? And then there was another person who was like, oh, no, I'm not Jewish, but I really want to study abroad in Israel. And I'm like, but you literally went on the news saying that you were a Kurdish Jew. And he's like, no, I'm not, but I want to study in it. And I'm like, oh my God. So they invited this rabbi. They claimed he was like the chief rabbi of Kurdistan. It was this really scary thing, because the rabbi was, you could say, being used. I don't know what to say, but the media didn't really interrogate it very well or report it very well at all. So then, unfortunately, when the rabbi wouldn't certify them, when their asylum applications got rejected, when they couldn't do Aliyah, they tried to show that it was like really dangerous to be Jewish. And then that was the thing where I went from being just a Jewish person feeling safe to becoming the Jewish person. And then that was when I experienced a danger, unfortunately. So when I talk about how safe it is, I really want people to also be aware that there is a threat, but it's not necessarily a threat they would expect. And it's a bit sinister that they put on this facade, claiming that they're a long-lost congregation. It's unfortunate. It's a strange story. It's hard to talk about. Yeah.
How do your family feel about you being there, given the potential threat that you just spoke to us about?
Well, they obviously don't like it, but I just recently started writing about the experience, because I was like, I have to write about it, because that's a major way to get awareness, and that way people know also about like what has to be done, not about myself, but just like the things that have to be addressed for there to be safety and for there to be reconciliation. And the idea of people trying to derail that just so they can make money or something. So, I really had to go through a lot of grief. And that was one thing which was kind of hard to even find the words for. Like, I wasn't sure what to call it. But in the end, I was like, I guess I have to call it grief, because I lost the life I had. Like, I felt so happy. I felt so comfortable. But then I received a duty to warn, where the FBI calls and they tell you that there's a group or a person or something that's trying to kill you. And in this case, it was like very, very, very urgent. And it was this terrifying experience. And security came to my home. And it was terrifying and pretty much was like, you can never see your home again. You can never see your apartment again. That was where it started. And I had to, in an instant, my life was gone, the life that I knew. And there was a lot of not just personal feelings, but this sense that like for so long I had really had this dream that Kurdish Jews could visit Kurdistan and feel safe. And I didn't feel like I didn't feel necessarily that it was a loss for them, but I felt somehow for their ancestors who had left, like someone's grandfather, it just made me feel like deeply apologetic, this feeling that like they left and then I went back, and it took years, but finally I understood why they had left. And that was a really heartbreaking experience. Like, I don't know if I'm making any sense. I don't know if I'm talking clearly about it, because it's so hard to talk about something that's that traumatic. But it was really hard. So anyways, the question after that was like, what do I do? And I decided that I shouldn't be quiet. I shouldn't lose my voice. I should work hard, and I should continue working hard on what I really care about. So eventually I was able to go back home. Thankfully, I was really blessed. By the way, I did contact authorities in the Kurdistan region to tell them that I have received this duty to warn. I spoke to the Ministry of Endowment and Religious Affairs, because they actually appointed a Jewish representative who gave an interview, and he openly spoke about not being Jewish. Like I was like, you guys, like these people are really dangerous, because they're giving interviews about not being Jewish, but they're trying to exert control over Jewishness, and they're openly saying things like, we believe that we should control property, we should control they had very anti-Semitic beliefs, that there was gold left behind, that there was Jewish gold hidden somewhere. It was like the lowest of the low. And so I contacted the ministry, and they all unfortunately turned a blind eye. It was like this really shocking thing about like, wow, this is how violence happens. This is how violence is allowed to happen. But thankfully, I have a friend, and she's Kurdish, and she is really good with security. She's involved with security, and we're able to, you could say, make a plan about, realistically, what would my death be? Like, how would I be killed? Do I have to worry about walking down the street? Do I have to worry about going to restaurants? Do I have to worry about taking taxis? Do I have to worry about driving? Like, what are the things I have to worry about? And we made a really comprehensive plan and backup plans. And like, if I have to like literally run out of my home, like where's safe spots to go to? And that became my new life. So that's part of why I've thankfully have an American passport, or any foreign passport, and thankfully I do have the ability to like go to Israel and meet people and have a great time, and hopefully in the future spend more time or live in Israel full time. But how do I say, I've been very blessed to make the most of it, but Kurdistan will always still be my home. Like, I still spend like a large part of the year there, and I still go back and forth, and I'm really grateful for that even despite this horrible danger and the lack of intervention by the government, that I've been able to still go back. That's much too on, sorry.
Yeah, so well, what's fascinating for me, and then we'll wrap up and just give some closing thoughts. But I think one of the things I found most fascinating with this conversation is I get the sense that you're a massive optimist. Like, you're very hopeful, and you're very in love with the Kurdistan region, the Kurdistan, the Kurds, and with the Jewish Kurdish community. And so there's a lot of love and hope there. So much so that you opened the conversation saying you felt safer in Kurdistan than, say, in America or London. but then you get this like credible threat from the FBI. I've never had the FBI ring me up. I've had the CST, but never the FBI. The CST is like a Jewish community security trust. But to have the FBI suggest like there's some quite serious risks there, and it sounds like there are actual real risks, and it's like it sounds like you've almost got this inner conflict where you're in love with the region, you're in love with the people, but at the same time you're forced to acknowledge that it isn't as safe as, I don't know, Crown Heights. Actually, no, forget Crown Heights. Say New Jersey. Is that a fair read of how what you've described?
Well, I think it is in a lot of ways. I would explore it a bit more, like the idea that I spent so many years of my life, like really becoming an adult, my years after university, and it was kind of a weird thing also because I started university when I was really young. I was 13 when I started UCLA, and I was doing my undergrad, and then I left and I went back and I was back and forth. But when I actually graduated, I was 23. So I had a lot of, you could say, adulthood behind me. But when I went to the Kurdistan region, that was my first time really becoming myself. Starting university at 13, it's not like it didn't feel like staying in university when I was 22, 23 was really my adulthood yet. So I had so many years of feeling so confident in my safety and security. And for anybody visiting, I genuinely feel it's safe because my threat was not because I'd be walking down the street and someone raises a sword, like some orientalized image of an riding over on a horseback. It's nothing like it's not like terrorists running from the mosque to my home. Nothing like that. Absolutely nothing like that. And in fact, the government is very good. Like any society, there are cases of incitement, and in general, the government has been very good about looking at incitement when it happens, and even fining people, arresting them, being very clear that there's no place for incitement. So that is a blessing. But the part that was really heartbreaking for me was realizing that there was that limit where when I became symbolic enough, when people felt that like hurting me would send a message, then that was a very different thing. So yeah, you're right. When I there is that tension, that like inner conflict, but it's also recognizing that my situation became very unique. And part of it is because my situation is so singular. Like there's nobody else really living there full time, vocally involved in Jewish issues, involved in Jewish heritage sites, in defending them, essentially becoming an obstacle, for anybody who thinks that there's like, and I'm not kidding, who literally thinks that there's like gold hidden under old synagogues. Like people coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, we're long lost Jews because they think there's gold hidden under synagogue. Like if they're going to hurt someone, it would be me. That being said, I have spoken to other people involved in projects, things like this, and they have also received intimidation and harassment, but it's only been from these same people, and it's only been in the context of that. So visiting, walking around, ironically, like I'm probably safer walking down the street than I am there than in LA. So I still hope that's true, but symbolically speaking, my life changed, and unfortunately.
That makes perfect sense. In the same sense that the prominent rabbis in America and the UK will have security attachments for the same reasons. Okay, what we'll do, we'll open up to questions for 10 minutes if there are any from the audience. But before that, have you got any closing thoughts that you'd like to end on?
I think my only closing thought was thank you so much for the platform and the opportunity to talk about things. And the topics are really, really heavy sometimes. When it comes to the broader issues of Jewish heritage in an Islamic society, Jewish heritage in Kurdistan, Kurdish people, these are really serious topics, and lives have been on the line. Kurdish lives depend on people knowing about Kurdistan. And a lot of times it's argued that, the Kurdistan region has a very strong moral footing. It's argued about all the goodness about Kurdistan, almost that Kurds have to deserve to live. And I think that kind of shows just how big the threats are against Kurdish people. So these are very heavy topics. And I always struggle with, as someone who's not Kurdish, doing justice to it, and also encouraging people to then learn about Kurdish voices directly. Like, okay, this is a great opportunity for me. But I really urge anybody who wants to learn more about Kurdish people, go on Twitter, go on Instagram, go on Facebook. There are wonderful Kurdish voices. I'm hesitant to name any specific ones right now, but you can go on Twitter Kurds, just some general people, for example, Bakhtiar Goran. Look at Kurdish news channels. Just in general, learn more about it. Don't think of me as the end. Think of me as the intro, a welcome. I made an introduction, and then the other thing I would just add in closing is, a lot of these things sometimes become very personal, and I can't separate an academic view from my own personal experience coming under threat. The emotions stir. So I hope that I spoke clearly enough and be able to get the facts through, but also not hide myself in the conversation.
Not at all. It's been absolutely fascinating conversation. What we'll do, if anyone in the chat does have any questions, please fire them now and we'll share them and hopefully get you an answer. So let me just check. I'm just going to go to the comments now. Don't know if this is a question, but it's got a question mark. Let's have a look. Okay. Let me just read this. This is dangerous. Would it not be great if a member of the Jewish community could travel to any part of the world and be embraced with love in time? But it's also great to hear there are people who are openly friendly. The Kurdish people are incredibly brave people. That's not a question. Sorry, it had a question mark in, so I read it. It's a statement. See if we got any more. Just scroll through. We got lots on Israel, lots of statements from our resident extremists and anti-Semites. We got Kenny Ken in the chat. Let's see what Kenny Ken's saying this week. Islamic State of Israel coming after the Zionist Greater Israel. Okay, Kenny.
Oh my gosh, that's exciting. It's one thing where education is so important, because I have met some people in Kurdistan who will say something like, "Oh, I can't wait for the day that Israel goes to the Euphrates." I'm like, that's not a thing. That is not the definition. That is not ever going to happen. That's not education is so important for people to understand what is Israel. And I'm like, Israel is half the size, even a fraction of the size of one single province in Iraq. I'm like, we have to let Jews live somewhere. Education is so important.
So we got a question which again has nothing to do with Kurdistan, but a regular Speaker's Corner Muslim speaker. How come Mohammed Hijab and his crew were allowed to scream ISIS slogans like "We love death like you love life" and harass Jewish families facing no consequences? I mean, I'm the first person to criticize Mohammed Hijab. I've debated the man many times, but he didn't scream ISIS slogans, because if he did, he would 100% be facing legal consequences. He did say some pretty extreme statements, but I don't think he actually crossed any legal laws with what he said. I think legally you're allowed to say "we love death." It's just a bit of a jarring statement.
Just makes you a bit of a sad sack. Yeah, if that's your genuine opinion, it's a bit of a shame, really, isn't it?
So here we go.
We've
got a question for you from Nato. From which part of Kurdistan are you from?
Oh yeah, I think I think Nato asked a few times too. I'm not Kurdish, and because I'm a foreigner, that's actually been a source of a lot of privilege. Being able to sometimes speak more, visit Israel, go back and forth to America, things like that. So I'm not Kurdish, but I do live in the Kurdistan region, which is the Iraqi areas where Kurds have a majority. Answer the question.
We have a follow-up question. When are you coming to Israel?
Oh, I'm hoping. So I actually was just in Israel a few weeks ago. It was really cool. I was still the pandemic. It's just been I can't believe how much time has gone by. But I'll hopefully be going back before the end of the year. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe eventually someday permanently, but yeah, before the end of the year.
Excellent. Okay, so we have no other questions, so I think I'll hand it over to Alexander to lead us out.
Yes, so thank you so much, Levy, for coming on the show and sharing your experience with us and with our viewers as well. One last thing, tomorrow, 7 o'clock, we have another live show, and this time with Ken Roth is going to be a guest on our show. Ken is the father of Malka Roth, who very sadly was murdered in the Sbarro pizza massacre, and we're going to be talking with Ken about his ongoing struggle to bring the murderer of his daughter to justice. So we're going to be having that conversation tomorrow from 7 o'clock on the channel. So we'll see you all then. So
Excellent.
Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow.
Like, follow, subscribe. Make sure you're checking us out on Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell.
Technological.
So make sure you're following us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all the social medias. And if you'd like to support the work, you can do so on Patreon or by purchasing the merch, which you can find on israeladvocacy.net. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
David, thanks so much for joining us.